the World Bank for hosting these meetings and all of you for attending today. I'd like to start by stepping back and speaking about how far we've come. 3 years ago, when I attended my first annual meetings as Treasury Secretary, the COVID-19 pandemic was raging. Many of the events were virtual. The IMF had just revised downward its projections for global economic growth due to continued supply chain disruptions and new COVID variants. Today, the situation is very different. Though progress across economies has been uneven, the global economy has proven resilient. America's strong economic performance is leading the way as a key engine of global growth. At home, thanks to the Biden-Harris administration's economic agenda, we went from millions having lost their jobs to an historic labor market recovery. Unemployment is near all-time lows, and U.S. real wage growth has outperformed that of most other advanced economies. U.S. economic growth has also been almost twice as fast as most other advanced economies this year and last, even as inflation came down sooner. As a recent Brookings analysis puts it, the U.S. is significantly outperforming its peers. We're now working to sustain this momentum, including through major investments in infrastructure, advanced manufacturing, and clean energy that other countries have sought to emulate. This morning, the IMF again upgraded its forecast for the U.S. outlook as it did in 2023, when U.S. growth ultimately came in at almost double the IMF's projection earlier that year. Our administration has also been focused beyond our borders. From day one, we rejected isolationism that made America and the world worse off and pursued global economic leadership that supports economies around the world and brings significant benefits to the American people and the U.S. economy. We will further this approach this week, including by together continuing to respond to global conflicts. For more than 2 years, the coalition we formed in the immediate aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine has stood strong. Our novel price cap on Russian oil has restricted Russia's revenues while keeping energy markets well supplied. We continue cracking down on Russian sanctions evasion, and as soon as next week, we will unveil strong new sanctions targeting those facilitating the Kremlin's war machine, including intermediaries in third countries that are supplying Russia with critical inputs for its military. We've also been working tirelessly to unlock the economic value of the Russian sovereign assets immobilized in our jurisdictions to support Ukraine. The United States is also using all the tools at our disposal in response to the conflict in the Middle East. We've worked to hold the Iranian regime accountable for its destructive behavior across the region by sanctioning terrorist actors, including Hamas, the Houthis, and Hezbollah, with over 1,000 Iran-related sanctions since 2021 and multiple rounds of designations in recent weeks. Earlier this month, we took additional decisive action to intensify pressure on Iran in response to Iran's attack on Israel, expanding sanctions to target Iran's effort to channel revenues from its energy industry to finance deadly activities. And we're more broadly focused on doing what we can to increase stability in the region, including by working to ensure that legitimate aid flows reach Gaza, imposing sanctions on Israeli violent extremist settlers and pressing Israel to maintain vital correspondent banking relations with Palestinian banks. We look forward to the Israeli cabinet extending the waivers to preserve correspondent banking relationships for banks in the West Bank by the end of the month deadline to support economic stability in the West Bank. This week, we'll maintain our focus not only on taking decisive action in response to conflicts, but also on addressing challenges that threaten to hold back global growth, such as emerging markets and developing countries facing significant debt vulnerabilities and a desperate need for investments in infrastructure and clean energy. One of many devastating impacts of Russia's war on Ukraine has been the spike in food insecurity. So we worked with partners to support the launch of the International Financial Institution Action Plan to address food insecurity, and we've seen it deliver results. IFI's increasing lending to the food and agriculture sector by 60% following Russia's invasion and maintained that level of support through 2023. We now affirm President Bonga's commitment to reduce hunger and generate jobs by increasing investment in food systems, and will continue to work with the IFIs to move this work forward. To strengthen health systems, as the current Mpox outbreak underscores, remains urgent. We continue to support the Pandemic Fund, which has now allocated funding to projects in more than 40 countries across all regions. Confronting climate change, of course, also remains at the top of our agenda. The MDBs committed a record high of nearly $75 billion in climate finance to low and middle income countries in 2023, a 45% increase from 2021. And they're deploying new tools to help countries respond to crises and increase resilience. We will continue to work to make climate finance easier to access and to support additional private capital mobilization at the MDBs and through the Climate and Environment Trust Funds. There, we should turn to implementing the recommendations of the recently finalized review of the climate finance architecture that we worked with G20 partners to launch. And we've made significant progress putting conflict and fragility, pandemics, and climate change at the core of the MDB's work through the Evolution Agenda. The MDBs have responsibly stretched their balance sheets and pursued innovative financial measures that will enable $200 billion in additional lending capacity over the next 10 years. And as of July, the G20 estimates that measures that have already been identified could enable an additional almost $160 billion. This nearly $360 billion in total would be an annual increase of over 20% compared to 2023. Let me end by emphasizing that all of the investments we make in food security, global health, climate, and more won't deliver results if many low and middle income countries are devoting more resources to debt service than to spending on development priorities. We've made progress to strengthen our institutions to address these issues. We reached an historic agreement on a 16th general review of quotas at the IMF, which will increase IMF quotas by 50% so that it can continue playing its crucial role at the center of the global safety net. And we've approved capital increases at the EBRD and IDB Invest. But we need to do more. As we look ahead, our administration will keep pushing to further improve the common framework to quickly get support to countries in debt distress, calling for an ITER replenishment with a financing package and policy priorities that meet the needs of low-income countries, and implementing the Nairobi, Washington vision that President Biden and President Ruto launched in May, so that countries with strong policy frameworks facing liquidity stress receive the financing support they need to realize their sustainable development ambitions. Many of the challenges we face cannot be solved overnight, but I'm convinced that the sustained American economic leadership and engagement with partners we first restored and then strengthened over the past 3.5 years will be indispensable as we move forward. I look forward to furthering this approach this week as we celebrate the 80th anniversary of the Bretton Woods Institution. Thank you, and I'm now happy to take your questions.
Hi, thank you. David Lutter with Reuters. Secretary, good morning. Wonder if you could talk a little bit about the Russian sanctions that the U.S. is preparing to unveil as early as next week. This would be sanctions on third country intermediaries that are facilitating transactions to aid Russia's war effort. Can you describe what these are? You've long warned that financial institutions would face sanctions if they aid Russia's war effort under new authorities. Can we expect some banks in China or other countries to be hit? And then also, can you talk about the frozen Russian assets, what you hope to achieve here this week in terms of getting that $50 billion loan to Ukraine? Thanks.
So I'm not prepared to spell out the details of the actions that we'll take likely next week, other than to say that our approach has been to identify either Russian or third country entities and individuals who are working to help Russia acquire the materials that it needs for its military activities in Ukraine. And you should expect that some entities of that sort, such intermediaries, will be designated. And as you mentioned, we've also significantly in recent months strengthened our sanctions so that we can now designate and sanction financial institutions in third countries that we see working to facilitate payments that Russia makes to purchase the goods it's acquiring for military purposes. And we've already seen that this threat of secondary sanctions on financial institutions, which would mean that those institutions would be cut off from the U.S. financial system if they deal with sanctioned entities. We're seeing that already is having a significant effect. So further actions of that type remain high on our radar screen as well. You mentioned the $50 billion loan that the G7 leaders agreed to provide to Ukraine and asked me about the status of it. We're very close to finalizing America's portion of this $50 billion loan package. And what I want to emphasize is that the source of financing for these loans, this is not the American taxpayer What's happening here is that Russia is paying for this support, the $50 billion of support that we intend to go to Ukraine by the end of this year. It is the income on the assets that have been immobilized, Russian sovereign assets that have been immobilized in Euroclear, that are the source of repayment. And we've agreed with Ukraine that even if there is a final settlement and a truce is reached, that it will be Russian funds that will go to repay these loans. So this is a way in which we're making Russia bear the cost and the expense of the damage that it's inflicting on Ukraine. I'll be meeting tomorrow with my Ukrainian counterpart, and in particular expect to receive assurances that the profits from Russia's assets will pay back this loan. So I would say that we expect to be able to contribute $20 billion to the $50 billion G7 package, although there's just a little bit more work to do to finalize the details.
Thank you. Secretary, you said last week that the U.S. is ramping up its sanctions on Iranian oil. And OFAC earlier this week issued an advisory warning companies about new risks associated with the Russian oil price cap. Do you feel like you can tighten sanctions on both Iranian oil and Russian oil without spiking oil prices? Or is the urgency to act on both these cases greater than any risk in terms of a price spike that we could see? Thank you.
So we have been very careful in our actions thus far to make sure that global markets are well supplied, and we do want to make sure that that remains the case. However, what we're seeing is, even with this increase in hostilities in the Middle East, that oil prices have declined, not risen. U.S. oil and natural gas production has reached record levels. China's demand, given the reduction in its growth projections, has declined, and that's put some downward pressure on oil prices. And I believe there remains significant spare capacity in Saudi Arabia and other countries that could continue to keep oil markets well supplied, even if our actions with respect to Iran and Russia were to cause a decline in oil exports.
Madam Secretary, you will be dropping by U.S. working group meetings with Chinese officials this week, and the issue of overcapacity has been discussed during these meetings, both in Washington and in Beijing. You know, what is your assessment on whether progress has been made on this issue and whether this has been enough? And how will the progress, affect U.S. trade policies or U.S. economic policies really going forward? Just one more thing as well, will you also be holding further bilateral meetings with your Chinese counterparts in D.C. this week? Thank you.
So both our economic working group and our financial working group with the Chinese will be meeting the economic group this week, and the finance group, I believe, next Monday. And I will briefly sit in on both of those meetings to hear about the progress that's being achieved. The Economic Working Group has been digging in great detail to the issue of overcapacity, trading analyses and data, and trying to come to a common understanding of how large support is in China for these investments in these advanced industries that concern us, and to see if we can iron out and come to a common understanding, and that will continue this week. China has announced a number of policies. I know my colleagues and I will be looking to deepen our understanding of those policies, their magnitude, and what impact they're likely to have on the economy. But in dealing with overcapacity, our view has been that raising consumer spending in China is, as a share of GDP, is really important, along with measures to address problems in the property sector. The consumer spending piece is important to achieving sustainable long-run growth in China in ways that will not create negative spillovers from overcapacity to the United States and many of our neighbors. And so far, I would say I haven't really heard policy announcements on the Chinese side that address that in the way that I was hoping.
Good morning, Secretary Yellen. Michael Stratford with Politico. I want to follow up on the question on the G7 loan backed by immobilized Russian state assets. Can you walk us through what the final sticking points here are, and what kind of assurances does the U.S. need that the assets will remain frozen in Europe and provide a reliable stream of earnings? And what's the path to doing that if the EU continues to renew those sanctions only every 6 months?
So I don't have details on the final steps we need to take to finalize this. Let me just say that we're 99% there, and it's nailing down just a couple of relatively small things. We're very close, and there's nothing significant that needs to be still worked out. Now, in terms of assurances, we have asked our European Union colleagues for greater assurances that the money will stay locked down and that the proceeds will be available to service these loans. So far, we have not received those assurances from the EU. That said, we have a very high degree of confidence that the money will be there and will remain locked down. So it is true that the European Union needs a unanimous vote every 6 months to continue locking down, using the interest on these immobilized assets for Ukraine. But this is not the vote that the European Union has to take pertains not just to these monies, but to the sanctions program on Russia that the EU has had in place. I believe it goes back to 2014 when Russia invaded Crimea. And so this is a matter of the assets being a small piece of a very broad sanctions program, which the European Union has unanimously supported every 6 months going way back. And I think if you talk to experts on European issues, they would say, and I strongly believe this, that it is truly inconceivable that with Russian the invasion ongoing in Ukraine, the idea that any member of the European Union would block a continuation of broad sanctions on Russia, that is really something that is unthinkable. So I think the assurances are already there. We asked for some modest strengthening, but feel good that this is a secure loan that will be serviced by Russian assets, by Russia, and not by American taxpayers.
Thank you, Colby Smith with the FT. You've described calls for widespread tariffs as deeply misguided, and the IMF today has warned that such policies will dent global growth. Can you elaborate more on the near-term economic impact of these policies and over a longer time horizon? How concerned are you about the potential impact of the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency?
Let's see. So you asked about tariffs and the dollar's status? Okay, so let me just start by saying I'm covered by the Hatch Act, and I want to be careful not to comment on detailed political proposals. But generally, I feel strongly, and I believe I'm in good company, that virtually all economists understand that when there is a broad-based program of tariffs at high levels, that will be reflected in domestic prices, higher domestic prices for those goods, and will have a very significant negative effect on consumers and also the competitiveness of firms that rely on imports of intermediate goods for their own production. In addition, those who are concerned about the U.S. trade deficit, it's really not at all obvious, and I think it's unlikely that measures of this type would make a great deal of difference to it. They're likely to end up strengthening the dollar. But I think it would have a very negative impact on the United States, on Americans who work in export industries, on consumers, and is a misguided approach. I think you also asked about the dollar, the status of the dollar. So I believe that the status, it is important to the United States that the dollar is and remains the world's primary reserve currency. And the status of the dollar, in my view, is really grounded in our strong macroeconomic performance, low inflation, institutions, strong capital markets, rule of law, and very deep and liquid capital markets. And there really is no other currency that I see as being a candidate in the near future to being able to replace the dollar. So I feel confident about the dollar's status.
How are you going to convince other countries to keep buying our debt?
By making sure that we stay on a sound fiscal path. And that does require deficit reduction over the coming years. I believe it's very important that we remain focused on keeping the real net interest cost of the debt near historic levels and certainly under 2%. President Biden and Vice President Harris have already taken steps to reduce 10-year deficits by around $1 trillion, in part by enacting a corporate alternative minimum tax, in part by lowering the cost of prescription drugs, both for households and also for the government, and in part by giving the Internal Revenue Services the resources that they need to close what is estimated over the next decade to be a $7 trillion tax gap. So there's a lot of money that is owed under our tax laws to the Internal Revenue Service that isn't being collected, and we're beginning to remedy that problem. The budget that we presented for 2025 includes $3 trillion over the next decade of additional deficit reduction. Much of that comes from asking wealthy taxpayers and corporations to pay their fair share, and at the same time permits investments that are necessary in our infrastructure and in people to promote equitable and sustainable growth in the United States. Thanks.